Hello my gorgeous friends, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hi, my name is Teresa. Today's video is actually a request from the lovely Jane. She goes by Jane Eldergoth on YouTube. So she asked me to look into Fred and Rosemary West and the, frankly, atrocities that they committed. So this is actually a two-part because there's so much information in this and I wanted to do it justice. So this first part is talking about their early years, how they got together, and a lot of the behaviours, etc. that may have formed them. As some of you may know, I am a behavioural psychologist, so I do think about these things from a psychological lens. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, fantastic. That is what I end up talking about. But I try not to go into too much detail in terms of the gruesomeness of it because I don't think it's very respectful. It's not for me. That being said, I do end up talking a little bit about some of their crimes, so if that's at all triggering for you, I would say just X out of this video now, take care of your mental health. But as I said, today's video is talking about their early years and their very initial crimes and them coming together as a couple. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, then do please keep on watching. Let's begin by chatting about Fred West. So he was born on the 29th of September 1943 and he was actually the second child to his parents, Walter and Daisy West. But he was the first surviving one because unfortunately Daisy had suffered a miscarriage with her first child, meaning that Fred was her first kind of live child. I think this had some sort of a significance in terms of the way that she treated Fred, because his siblings later said that he was a massive mama's boy and that his mum really showed a lot of preferential treatment towards him. But if his accounts are to be believed, there was a lot of stuff happening in the family home that kind of impacted his psychology. Obviously that's part of what I am quite interested in. But these are accounts that are taken from him during his time with the police, and his accounts may vary. So part of why I would say that we have to kind of take what he says with a pinch of salt is that his brother Doug actually maintains that what he said was a lie, and also Anne-Marie, his eldest daughter, has gone on the record of basically saying that he's a compulsive liar. In an interview that she did, she basically said, take what he says, half it, then half it again, and somewhere in there is the truth. So that is something to kind of keep in mind, that there might have been some truth to what he's saying, but it's very difficult to determine what. Now, we'll go with what it is that he was saying occurred. There was some kind of thought that his father was quite abusive, and there was a lot of incestuous relationships happening within that household. He grew up in Herefordshire in a very small rural area, and they were used to kind of country living and all of the things that come with that. So he was kind of used to his mother even being quite brutal with the animals and killing them and shooting them in front of him. So that sort of thing can kind of set up, it's modelling behaviour, Bandura would say, if we go back to early child psychology, and it can have an impact upon an individual's development. But apparently his mother was quite strict with them in terms of what was let fly, and she was very much the disciplinarian of the family. And his father kind of had a slightly different view of, well, you know what, if you want to do something and you don't get caught for it, then fair is fair. And this is what we would actually call as a double bind in parenting. So it leads to a lot of conflicting ideas. Now, if we are to believe Fred, he maintained that his mother began an incestuous relationship with him when he was about 12 or 13. So let's call it what it is. She sexually assaulted him, if that is the case, when he was 12 or 13. And that obviously had a major impact upon him, if that was the case. Now, it's said that Fred was actually quite a looker when he was younger, believe it or not. He was, when he was born, blonde haired and blue eyed, so very much the apple of his mum's eye. And apparently his brothers maintain he was incredibly popular with the ladies, which just makes me think of that, you know, sign from Hamilton, you know, we're undeniable with the ladies. Anyways, he was apparently pretty decent with the girls because he was apparently quite good looking at the time. And he did very much though have his father's idea of, you know, if you can get away with it, that's fine. Now, his mother was very strict on dating. She was like, you can't date until you're 21. That's what he said. But, you know, he wasn't going to have any of that. And, you know, he would hang out with a lot of the girls. Now, he eventually ended up getting a motorbike. You know, a lot of young guys, they want a motorbike. They want to look cool. They want to, you know, show off, I guess. And in 1958, when he was just, I think it was 16, 17, he was involved in a crash on that motorbike, and he crashed into a female pedestrian. She survived, she was fine, thankfully no major injuries. However, he came off the motorbike and he actually was in a coma for a week. And based upon the way that he went down on the bike, you could kind of surmise from that he endured a lot of prefrontal cortex damage. Now, the prefrontal cortex is very much in charge of your like your inhibition, your personality, your impulsivity. It's kind of like a big chunk of like what makes us us. There was a really interesting case study of this guy called Phineas Gage, and when he had a railroad spike shoved through his prefrontal cortex, his personality changed and he was apparently much more irritable and aggressive, which I'm like, I kind of would be more irritable and aggressive if I had like a railroad spike like shoved through my face, but you know, to each their own. But anyways, he was in a coma for a week. He sustained an awful lot of damage. He had like a limp, he broke his nose, and it really impacted the way that he looked. Now, his family actually said that his personality had changed an awful lot there. Now, we know from looking at fMRIs, CAT scans, all these sort of things, EEGs that look at the neural activation in the brain. If you look at individuals who engage in violent crimes, they are more likely to have damage to the prefrontal cortex or have a prefrontal cortex that is not entirely fully developed. So we could posit that that had an impact upon his later behaviour. And it was actually when he was recovering from all of this that he met Catherine Costello for the first time. She was also went by the name of Rena Costello. Now, if you know anything about this particular case, you'll kind of go, that's a very familiar name. Oh yes, trust me, my friends, I am getting to it. And he met her initially back in 1958, but nothing kind of happened from that. Then kind of back and forth, there were a couple of things kind of going on. He was like living his own life, if we can, you know, kind of call it that, I guess. And in 1961, he was in a pub in Ledbury, and like I said, a lot of his behaviour had changed, and his family said he had kind of changed quite a bit in the way that he would approach things, etc., etc. And he apparently attempted to grab a girl at the top of the stairs, and there's conflicting reports, but some people state that she basically punched him and he fell backwards, and he ended up again falling unconscious. So I kind of hope she did punch him. I know that sounds really bad, but like, you know, that's what you get if you try to, you know, put your hands on a woman without like asking for their consent. I'm just saying. But again, that additional damage to the brain could have an impact upon his later behaviour. Now, that same year in 1961, his younger sister Kitty actually kind of admitted to their mother that Fred had been assaulting her and she was actually pregnant. Now, this kind of went to the police, but the whole case ended up kind of falling apart because Kitty didn't want to kind of bring it that far, which, I mean, yeah, fair enough, like it's really complicated when it's family members, but oh my goodness. Now, she didn't end up having the child in the end. I think she lost the child, but like the seeds were sown there in terms of the way that he was going. Then in 1962, he actually ended up marrying Rena, and she was at this point already pregnant. Now, a little bit about Rena. She was from Glasgow and she worked as a prostitute, and her pregnancy at the time was down to one of her clients. Now, Fred apparently initially attempted to perform an abortion on her because he didn't want her to have the kid because it wasn't his, and he brought her to like a wooded area, but then apparently police arrived, so they abandoned it. So they got married in 1962, and he had kind of planned at that stage to say to people, oh, the kid is mine, you know, that's what's happened. But when Rena had her first child, called Charmaine, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that the kid could not have been Fred's. Her biological father was of Pakistani origin, so it was pretty clear that there was no biological basis for that. So they actually had to construct a totally different story, which basically outlined that they had adopted Charmaine, and that was what went on. So apparently that was kind of the route that they were going on, that particular one. Now, when they went up to Glasgow, you know, Rena was still engaged as a prostitute and she was working as a stripper. Apparently Fred found that all absolutely amazing. He loved it, which, you know, fair enough. But he could be incredibly controlling, and apparently if he looked for sex and she refused, as is her right, he would get very aggressive and very argumentative and all that sort of thing. Now, at the same time, he was actually working as an ice cream man, which that makes you think about 99s in a slightly different way. Don't know about you, but don't quite have the appetite for them in the same way. So they would often go out on nights out, himself and Rena, and they often looked for babysitters, etc. because at this point they had Charmaine, but Rena also had fallen pregnant with her second child, which was to be Fred's first child, Anne-Marie. And they would look for people to look after the kids while they got up to whatever they got up to. And they found a woman called Isa McFall, who then introduced Anna McFall to the fold. Now, Fred kind of talks about Anna McFall later on in police custody, and he says, you know, that she was really beautiful, and she actually came up to him when he was working in the ice cream van, and that he kind of took her under his wing because it turned out that her mother was essentially like an alcoholic, and he felt really bad for her. Like, yeah, but you'll kind of see, yeah, I had a little bit of a history for going for really specific targets of people, you know. But in 1965, when, you know, when working as an ice cream man, he actually killed a young boy. Apparently it was an accident. Now, at that time, this sort of thing happened apparently relatively regularly, so nothing kind of came of it, but he decided, I don't want to live here anymore, I don't feel comfortable being here anymore, I want to get out. But Rena had absolutely no interest in leaving. You know, she was based there, she was quite happy to be there, and she basically stayed on. But he went back to Herefordshire, which was where he was from, and he actually ended up in a caravan site. Now, Anna McFall actually followed him down there, and they ended up in a relationship. So, you know, there was a whole thing going on there. Now, Rena went back, and at this point she was in a relationship with somebody, I think it was like John McLaughlin or something, and she went down with Isa McFall as well, and she knew that Anna McFall was there as well. So they had planned to try and take Charmaine and Anne-Marie back with them because she wanted to be reunited with them, and she knew that kind of Fred wouldn't really allow it. So they had kind of decided they were going to do it one night, and weirdly, Fred came back from work early and caught them in the middle of them trying to take the kids out, and a skirmish ensued, and Rena and Ina and John ended up going, and they were like, hey Anna, are you coming too? And Anna was like, no. And it seems that Anna essentially tipped them off to let them know that, hey Fred, this is what's going on. You know, they're going to be trying to take your kids away. And that's possibly why he came back so early. So, you know, the plot doth thicken. But anyways, she got together with Fred. She fell pregnant. Now, she was quite heavily pregnant, actually. And to the point that even Fred's family knew about it. Like, he'd gone back to them kind of saying, oh, you know, I'm going to have another baby. And they were like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, another child, fantastic. Now, Fred is so all over the place. Like I said, bit of a pathological liar. He went on to state that he came back one day and Anna was already dead, that Rena had come back, she was jealous, and she had brought her pimp, and the pimp had killed Anna. Now, that was all rubbish, essentially. But it seems that he ultimately kind of wanted Rena to come back, and with Rena coming back in this scene, he saw basically Anna as being a threat to all of that happening, because you have to think back to that whole thing with the parents and kind of like, you know, if you can get away with it, it's fair game. And he figured, well, I can get away with having had my fun with Anna as long as Rena doesn't know, because Rena was totally a mother substitute. Like, you know, there was so much going on there. But he ended up murdering her. Now, he actually dismembered her and put her into a field in Mulhern. Now, like I said, at the time she was actually pregnant with his child, so you know, there was a lot of callousness there. And this was in 1968. Now, he had dismembered her, but he'd also weirdly ended up, like when they did subsequently find her body, they found that she was missing things like kneecaps and fingers, etc. So there was a thought that maybe he did that to circumvent any sort of kind of detection at the time. But why take the kneecaps? It does seem to be almost like a trophy that some serial killers will go for. But this was going on at the time, so he was still minding Anne-Marie and Charmaine. Now, I say minding in like the loosest sense, like he was incredibly abusive, particularly sexually, like with the kids. It was gross, it was horrible. But he wasn't afraid to call contact like social services to kind of be like, hey, I'm finding this a bit tricky, maybe take these kids away from me for a little bit. Like, he'd use them for when it suited him. It was really, really weird. And it was then in 1968, when he was at the age of 27, that he met Rose Letts, for the first time when she was aged 15, and that was when their relationship began. So let's think about Rosemary Letts. So she was born in November 29th, 1953. Now, before we get into her birth, we actually have to talk about her mother. Now, her mother struggled an awful lot with chronic depression. Like, it was crippling, to the point that actually her doctor at the time recommended that she undergo electroconvulsive therapy. Now, this is a treatment that has been in use since about the 1930s. It's still actually in use today. There is some data behind it, but it's kind of one of those things that is only used for treatment-resistant psychosis, depression, mania, etc. because it's very severe. It's one of those like last cause type things. Now, what it involves is introducing an electric current through the body that should like essentially rewire the brain. It's the most simplistic way of looking at it. But at the time, the sort of electroshock that we're talking about would have been so violent that people would have broken bones, broken teeth. Like, it was huge. Now, why am I bringing this up? Daisy Letts, because that was her name. Yeah, that's right. Rose and Fred both had mums called Daisy. There you go. She had really chronic depression at the time, and her physician at the time said, you should undergo ECT, even though she was pregnant at the time with Rosemary. Now, I give some lectures on teratogens and kind of the birth cycle and prenatal development, and there are critical points in the development of the fetus that impact development of the brain, different parts of the body, etc. And at any point in the fetal development, if there's any sort of things like even maternal stress, a mother getting a cold, things like that, it impacts the fetal development. So even up till I think it was a week before she delivered and had Rosemary, she was still having ECT. She was still having ECT. Now, it's pretty clear that that had a major effect on Rosemary's kind of future development, because she would apparently just sit in her crib for hours and stare and sometimes rock backwards and forwards. That's what we would call a stereotypy or stereotypy, depending upon where you are on the planet. So it does kind of seem that it did somewhat impact her, with even her mother saying really horrible things like calling her Dozy Rosie. So let's have a little chat about the rest of Rose's private life, shall we? Her father was called Bill, and he was not a pleasant man. Apparently, a lot of the neighbours, and it was a very nice area that she grew up in, a lot of the neighbours could actually hear them fighting, and they kind of had an idea about how cruel he could be. Now, he was actually schizophrenic, so he had his own mental health issues. Now, we know that the hereditary nature of mental health issues does pass down, and if you have somebody in your family who has a mental health illness, you may have one yourself. There is like a genetic comorbidity there, so it was already putting Rosemary at risk of some mental health issues. But he could be quite abusive, and he expected everything to be incredibly clean, and I think it partly came from him being in the army for a period of time, so he kind of expected things to, in a way, a certain standard. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was also incredibly sexually abusive. So Rosemary was sexually assaulted from a very young age, and this is actually verified by her sister Patricia, who said that yes, they were assaulted as children and that Rosemary got the brunt of it. So she was really groomed, and she learned to sexualize herself to kind of get out of things. That was just like, I guess, a coping behavior in a way. But she herself, like, the whole thing like impacted her behavior as well, because she was groomed and kind of was used to these sort of things, to the point that she actually started to molest and assault her own brothers as well. So there was very much a pattern of behavior that was forming very, very early on in her childhood. So that's kind of where we're coming at from Rosemary. She kind of lived on and off with her dad. Her mum left for a period of time, and when she was about 15, 16, she was told by her dad, hey, you need to get a job. So, you know, she did what she was told, and she went and she got a job at a local bakery. And it was when she was actually waiting for a bus that she came across a man who was older than her. And apparently he was kind of a bit all over the place. She thought that there was something wrong with him, and you know, he was like really unhygienic, but she kept talking to him anyways. She was quite put off by him. Turned out it was Fred, and they soon kind of hit it off, and he asked her out and she said no, but he was very persistent and turned up at her place of work. So he turned up at the bakery and said, hey, you know, come on a date with me, we'll go to a pub that's near where you work. So eventually he kind of wore her down, and she said, yeah, I'll go. And he turned up to this pub with a lace dress and a fur coat, which, knowing him, it was probably stolen, you know, just saying. But that was the start of their relationship. Now, at this point, he is, by the way, still married to Rena Costello. Anna McFall had just been murdered a few months earlier by Fred. So, you know, if you're looking at this from the outside, you're kind of going, oh God, Rosemary is going to be his new victim because she meets the profile. You know, she's a vulnerable population, this is what's going to happen. And it's not like, you know, him being in a romantic relationship with somebody is going to stop him from hurting them. He doesn't really care about that. But yeah, things started to change. He started a relationship with Rosemary. They both found that they had very similar kind of sexual predilections, and you know, I'd say that's probably what stopped her from becoming a victim of his. And she was 15 at the time, like I said, and she basically tried to move in with him in his caravan, and he started to advertise her wares as a prostitute. So at 15 she was doing that. Now her father's friends found out about this because this was all happening locally, and they got onto Bill, which was Rosemary's dad, and told him. Now they had never approved of the relationship anyways. Rosemary's mum Daisy actually said that she believed that Fred was a pathological liar. Like, yes, hells yes. Yes, he absolutely is. But what he did then, what Bill did then, was he contacted social services and said, hey, you know, my 15-year-old daughter is doing XYZ and I'm concerned about her and I need your help. So what social services did was they basically removed her from that particular situation and put her into the Cheltenham school for troubled girls, and she stayed there until she was 16. But even when she was there, she would over the weekends go to Fred. On her 16th birthday she got out, she left, she went back again, and again the last ditch effort, Bill again contacted social services in, I think it was 1970, and the police came, picked her up. You know, they were like, yeah, here she is, a minor, and she's with this like 27, 28-year-old man. This is all a bit weird. And they did an examination and they found that she was pregnant. Sorry guys, my camera cut out because, you know, I was taking so long. Anyways, what happened was the boarding home found out that she was pregnant, and she said, hey, it's okay, I'm not going back to Fred, I'm actually going to go out and terminate my pregnancy. So they actually let her leave the boarding home under those conditions. So she went off to, by the way, terminate her pregnancy, but she didn't. She just went straight back to Fred and was right back at square one. And at this point her dad basically gave up and said, well, it's clear she just wants to be there, so let's have it be. So of course now it led to her and Fred living in a little caravan together with 2 kids, 2 from his previous marriage, which was still in effect, and her with a baby on the way. When we look at Rosemary, probably due to all the damage that she sustained early on in her development, it impacted her like psychological development and her ability to kind of do things. So when she started off, she was all like, oh yay, kids, and I'm going to be such a great mom. But she kind of figured out, actually, they're not dolls and they kind of have their own personalities. And she ended up being I can't even say a disciplinarian, because she was just horrible. Like, she would abuse the kids, and they would like strip them naked and like beat them, and it was just absolutely horrific. But they soon kind of figured out the 2 of them had a very similar approach to things, very, very twisted. Now in November of 1970, Fred was actually arrested for petty crime because he did an awful lot of that. Again, come back to the prefrontal lobe damage, the whole thing around disinhibition, impulsivity. So he got arrested for petty theft, and he got put into prison for 10 months. So that left a very young Rosemary with 2 children who were not her own. And she was, you know, also like pregnant at the time with Heather, her first kid. And Charmaine, who was Rena's first child, would be quite belligerent and would get very annoyed with Rose and kind of point out, well, you know, you're not my real mom and you can't tell me what to do. And it's probably down to this and Rose's own impulsivity issues that Rose actually ended up killing Charmaine in June of 1971. So that was while Fred was actually in prison. So at this point, you know, Fred has murdered one person, Anna McFall, and now Rose has matched him. They are 1 for 1. So she doesn't say anything and she hides her body in the coal bunker. Like, and this is an 8-year-old child. Like, this is absolutely, totally disgusting. Like, there are no words for this sort of thing. So then Fred gets out of jail about a month or so later, and Rena actually comes down because Rena has been looking for her kids. Obviously, she misses them, and she asks loads of questions about wanting to see Charmaine and Anne-Marie, but of course Charmaine is unfortunately no longer in the picture, and Fred had actually buried her in the backyard at this point when he came back. So Rosemary kind of waited for him to come back to fix it in a way, as in to sort out her mess. So he brought Rena out drinking, and he got her incredibly drunk and actually brought her to Mulhern, which is where he had buried Anna McFall, and murdered her there, dismembered her and put her body there, all because she was asking about Charmaine, and well, they had to tie up some loose ends. So I guess the couple that stays together, because in January 1972, Rosemary and Fred actually got married, and at the ceremony, Fred basically said he was a bachelor, but like, he had just a couple of months previously killed his previous wife, so nobody knew that she was no longer still alive. He'd never divorced her. It was a whole thing. But anyways, they decided, hey, let's try and make it look like we're living a life. Now they moved then to what is now quite frankly known as the infamous 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, and this is where a whole lot of kind of things went down there. And apparently part of how they got away with what they did was that this was an incredibly transient community. So that's how they got away with a whole chunk of that there. So in order to supplement their living at this particular house, they decided they would take on tenants. And one night while they were driving somewhere, they bumped into a young girl called Caroline Owens. Now Caroline was, I think, about 16 at the time, and at this point I think they had kind of figured out, hey, if we present ourselves as a married couple with kids, this works out quite well. So Caroline was waiting at the bus station to go home. Fred and Rose then asked her, well, do you want a lift? So she said, well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that would be super, super helpful. Because she didn't kind of perceive them as a threat. Again, it's so unusual for a man and a woman to be a threat together. So she didn't view it as anything problematic. She got on really well with them in the car. They were really nice. And she actually ended up confiding in them that she didn't get on very well with her parents and that she wanted to move out. And they said, hey, would you like to move in with us? And we have young kids and you could mind them and it would be great. So she actually agreed and moved in with them. Now things started to go a bit skewy, let's be real, and she got really freaked out when Fred came to her one day and said, oh, Anne-Marie isn't a virgin anymore. And she said, wait, what do you mean? And apparently Caroline Owens had gone through sexual assault herself as a young child, so she recognised some of the warning signs, and Fred tried to brush it off and say, oh well, you know, she was on her push bike and she had an accident and it penetrated her and that's what happened. So she was immediately weirded out and was like, right, I don't like this. And then they just kept coming on to her and asking her to engage in sex, and it was a whole thing and she started to feel really, really uncomfortable. So she left. It does just show, you know, trust your instincts. If your gut is telling you that these people are creepy, like, run. So she got out and she was again, like a month or two later, waiting at a bus stop, and they stopped and kind of called her over, and she was reluctant to go near them, but they kind of said like, oh, you know, we really miss you and the kids really miss you and they've been asking for you. And she actually said like, oh, I felt kind of mean to not go with them, so I decided to go with them. Like, isn't that really bad that that's the way we've been socialised, that we don't want to be seen as being mean? Like, that's particularly a thing with women. It's this whole thing of like, you must be agreeable. So she got in the car with them, and they started off first by being like, oh, the kids really, really miss you and we miss you and oh, please come back. And she was like, no, no. And then Fred started being weird and creepy, as Fred does, and started asking her, had she been with somebody, had she just had sex with her, with somebody. And he then asked Rose to essentially examine her, and she tried to sexually assault her, and of course she resisted, and they pulled the car over and tried to knock her out, and they brought her back to Cromwell Street. She was convinced, the poor thing, that she was going to die, and they were like abusing her. There was horrible physical assault, and it was just a night of terror. And towards the very end of it, Rosemary said, okay, you know, bring her down to the cellar and finish her off there. And Fred brought her down and sexually assaulted her, but said he'd let her go if she would come back and promise not to say anything. So poor Caroline, she was terrified, and you know, that survival instinct obviously kicked in, and she said, yeah, absolutely, you know, I'll come back. Like, yeah, if that's what you want, I'll come back. So she told them that she would come back, and she actually went to the police, which, yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, the police weren't very helpful, and she maintains that they were actually quite like disrespectful to her. I suppose it's just a different time. This was December 1972, and there was a lot of kind of like, oh, well, why did you even get in the car with them and all this sort of stuff. Now, it eventually went to trial, and it was quite clear, like, Rosemary was very involved. You know, this was not a case of Rosemary being like a passive participant. She was an active participant in the whole thing, and it went to trial, but poor Caroline was so incredibly traumatized from the whole incident and the way that she was even treated by the police that she wouldn't testify, and it was actually demoted to like a sort of an assault, and they just had to pay, I think it was £100. That was it. That was the lesson they had learned. But quite possibly it was Caroline going to the police, outlining all of this, that made the West think, we have to be a bit more careful about how we're going to approach this. But the appetite was already there. So in the next video, which is coming up on Thursday, I will continue to discuss Fred and Rosemary West and go into a little more depth as to some of their crimes, because otherwise it's going to be a ridiculously long video. So that's it for the first part of this kind of two-part series on Rosemary and Fred West, and the next video will be up in 2 days time, so on Thursday at 8 AM Irish time. So do please keep an eye out for that, and I will be talking further about their arrest, potential subsequent murders, and just how they were caught, all of the things around that. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, keep a little eye out for that. Other than that, do please like, comment and subscribe. Turn on that notification bell so you can find more videos of what I'm doing over here. Do please share, because sharing is caring, unless of course it's an STD, in which case, you know, wrap it up, don't be gross. But that's it, that's the end of the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.